Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. In a world where headlines change every hour and propaganda has become a permanent background noise, it's easy to lose sight of what is really happening behind the slogans and emotional sound bites. Today, I want to strip away that fog and talk calmly and directly about the hard strategic reality, how Washington is pushing for regime change in Venezuela, while at the same time trying to salvage a failing project in Ukraine against a Russia that is anything but isolated or defeated. If you're ready to hear a perspective you won't get from the mainstream and to look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict in the wider context of U.S. power, energy, and geopolitics, then let's begin. I want to look at what Washington's doing on two fronts that are tightly connected: the looming operation against Venezuela and the far more consequential confrontation with Russia in Ukraine. Taken together, they expose the same pattern: an American leadership still obsessed with regime change, resource control, and geopolitical domination, even as its power to enforce that order erodes and Russia steadily consolidates a far stronger position, militarily and diplomatically, than Western narratives are willing to admit. Let me start briefly with Venezuela, because what is unfolding there is not a side story. It is part of the same strategic logic that is driving U.S. policy in Ukraine. The President of the United States has used his Truth Social platform to announce what is effectively the closure of Venezuelan airspace under the pretext of targeting drug traffickers. If you read his statement carefully, it is not just a counter-narcotics measure. He clearly leaves the door open to airstrikes and even ground operations on Venezuelan soil aimed at overthrowing Nicolas Maduro. This comes on the heels of reporting in the U.S. media about a recent call between Trump and Maduro, in which Trump allegedly told him to resign and intimated that failure to do so could bring U.S. military action. That threat is not idle bluster. The U.S. now has impressive strike capability concentrated around Venezuela. 7 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, reportedly carrying around 250 Tomahawk cruise missiles between them. The Gerald R. Ford, the newest and most powerful aircraft carrier in the U.S. Fleet F-35 fighters deployed to bases across the Caribbean basin, including Puerto Rico, plus amphibious assault ships configured for expeditionary warfare. On top of that, it would be naive to assume that the CIA is not already operating inside Venezuela. Multiple sources point to ongoing covert work to prepare the ground for a potential intervention. All signposts point in the same direction. The United States is putting in place the architecture for a regime change operation and wants the world to get used to the idea before it pulls the trigger. The hypocrisy at the heart of this is glaring. Trump has just pardoned former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was convicted in U.S. courts for major drug trafficking into the United States. At the same time, the White House denounces Maduro as the head of a colossal narcotics cartel and uses that charge to justify military threats. Many observers have already noted the absurd contradiction. The man convicted of running cocaine into the U.S. is forgiven, and his political network in Honduras is being quietly helped back into power, while the leader, who has not been tried in any U.S. court, is branded the arch-narco and targeted for removal. When you strip away the rhetoric, the real aim is not drug control, but the restoration of American geopolitical primacy in Latin America. Viewed through that lens, the rest of the picture snaps into focus. Washington wants to gain direct leverage over Venezuela's vast oil reserves, to roll back Chinese and broader BRICS influence in Latin America, and to weaken Cuba by cutting off Venezuelan oil deliveries. The logic is simple: gain control over Venezuelan output, starve Havana of its key energy lifeline, and open the door to regime change in Cuba as well. Moscow has already signaled that it is ready to supply Cuba with oil. The Cubans have so far preferred to stick with Venezuelan barrels, but in the event of a crisis, they have every incentive to turn back to Russia. If that happens, and if the U.S. persists in escalation, one can easily imagine Russian and perhaps even Chinese military personnel deploying to Cuba under the banner of defending a long-standing partner and reminding Washington of the understandings reached in 1962 at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. For now, I am not going to dive further into the Venezuelan scenario because the attack has not yet begun, though I have been expecting it for some time, and I will not be surprised when it comes. The president may still be wavering between factions in his own administration, one urging decisive action, another warning that an invasion would be deeply unpopular with parts of his base and might bog U.S. forces down in a costly occupation that war games have already flagged as problematic. It is just possible that we are watching an elaborate bluff designed to scare Maduro into capitulation, but I doubt it. Washington has gone so far in its preparations and rhetoric that backing down now would be seen as a humiliating loss of face, and this is a White House that treats loss of face as intolerable. In any case, the Venezuelan theater is only one piece of a larger strategic struggle. The core of that struggle remains the war in Ukraine, and it is there that Russia is methodically reshaping the entire geopolitical landscape, while Kyiv and Washington flail between desperate military gambits and improvised diplomatic schemes that show far more weakness than strength. As I speak, a Ukrainian delegation headed by Rustam Umerov, himself under investigation in Ukraine for corruption, is in Miami. Among the delegation is Kyrilo Budanov, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence. One of his subordinates is reportedly in Florida as well, scheduled to meet or already meeting with Senator Marco Rubio, Eric Weinstein-Witkoff, and Jared Kushner to talk about what the Western press keeps calling a peace plan, but which Vladimir Putin has correctly dismissed as nothing more than a set of talking points. It is essential to underline one point, because Western commentary keeps ignoring it. Russia and the United States have not reached any agreement on any element of these proposals. None. Putin has said so bluntly, and his denial should be taken seriously. Yet supposedly serious articles continue to treat the 28-point plan as if it were a negotiated framework jointly accepted by Washington and Moscow. The reality is that there is no single authoritative text. The initial reporting in outlets like Axios and the Financial Times did not even match the later Ukrainian version leaked by MP Alexei Honcharenko. Russian officials have openly stated that multiple versions and variations of talking points are circulating, and that this may be true even for the now famous 28 points. On top of that, the number itself keeps shifting from 28 to 19 to 22, depending on which day you read which leak. No one should pretend that there is a fixed, mutually agreed blueprint on the table. The Ukrainians are flying into Miami to hear what the Americans now want them to accept, or at least to endorse publicly. Are they going to be told to withdraw from the Donbass, formally renounce NATO membership, accept legally binding ceilings on the size of their armed forces, rewrite their constitution, and restructure their political system to satisfy Washington's negotiation agenda with Moscow? Or is this yet another improvisation in which Kyiv presents its own wish list, Washington tries to mediate between that and Russia's red lines, and the plan gets rewritten again, drifting ever further from what Moscow can accept while leaning toward Ukrainian maximalism? For the record, I consider the second scenario more likely, and if that is what happens, it will only leave the Americans in a weaker position when they walk into the room with the Russians in Moscow. The rhetoric from both capitals makes clear how far apart the sides remain. Zelensky continues to give speeches that show no genuine willingness to compromise on any core issue. He is supposedly revising Ukraine's defense strategy with the new defense minister Denis Shmyhal under the pressure of battlefield defeats, but the tone of his statement suggests he still expects the war to continue indefinitely. On the Russian side, the really decisive voices, Putin, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, key figures in the Security Council such as Yuri Ushakov and Dmitry Kozak have been notably restrained in public over the last 24 hours. But what has been said is telling. The Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, reacting to the resignation of Andriy Yermak as Zelensky's chief of staff, dismissed it as pure theater, a PR maneuver by a regime she likened to a deflating balloon throwing ballast overboard in the hope of staying aloft. Her conclusion was chillingly clear. In the end, all of these people, including Zelensky himself, will face trial not only for corruption, but for their wider crimes during the war and before it. That line is not new. Early in the special military operation, the Russian Defense Ministry warned that the perpetrators of war crimes and related offenses in Ukraine would eventually be punished. Putin himself has never spelled this out in the same brutal terms, but when the top spokesperson of the foreign ministry repeats this message now, on the eve of supposed negotiations, the signal is unmistakable. Russia is in no mood to grant political amnesties to the current Ukrainian leadership, and it certainly does not intend to treat Kyiv's ruling clique as respectable partners in some grand compromise. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov underscored this when he told the Duma that Russia has already made all the concessions it can. There will be no further step back from Russia's red lines and no abandonment of the objectives publicly announced at the start of the operation. Putin's recent press conference in Bishkek put more flesh on those bones. He explicitly dismissed the notion that there is any existing agreement with the United States and made it clear that Russia expects all four of its newly incorporated regions, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, to be recognized as Russian territory. His words flatly contradicted the Western fantasy that Moscow is prepared to accept a ceasefire in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions in exchange for a Ukrainian withdrawal from Donbass alone. In Putin's framing, a ceasefire becomes possible only when Ukrainian forces withdraw from all territory that Russia regards as its own, including Zaporozhye and Kherson. On top of that, he insisted that Washington must formally recognize these regions as Russian, and he expressed open irritation at the semantic games about de facto versus de jure recognition. For Moscow, this ambiguity will not suffice. The Americans will have to say clearly what they are prepared to acknowledge, and that is what the Russians intend to force into the open in any serious talks. What Moscow now expects from the upcoming visit of Rubio, Witkoff, and Kushner is not a final deal, but a coherent set of discussion points that can form the basis for properly structured negotiations. Russia wants those negotiations to be conducted the way serious states have always conducted them, with formal delegations, clear mandates, and an institutional framework. On the Russian side, that would mean a team led by the foreign ministry and fronted by a seasoned diplomat, supported by key presidential advisors like Ushakov and negotiators like Vladimir Medinsky, who previously led the Russian side in Istanbul. Moscow assumes that Washington, if it is serious, will respond with a comparable team and not just a gaggle of presidential courtiers shuttling proposals by back channel. What Russia emphatically does not want and will not accept is a fait accompli in the form of a Miami drafted document signed by Kiev and presented in Moscow as a ready-made peace agreement. If Rubio and company show up with a Ukrainian signature and demand that Russia sign on the dotted line, declaring the war over and the settlement complete, they are heading straight for a rude awakening. Anyone who has listened carefully to Putin and Ryabkov should understand that this is not how Moscow intends to proceed. Russia will not allow Ukrainian politicians, whose own future is hanging by a thread, to define the terms of a strategic settlement that directly concerns Russia's security and territory. The deeper problem for Washington and Kyiv is that they are trying to improvise diplomacy on top of a deteriorating military situation. The latest battlefield reports point to another clear Russian victory in Donbass, centered on the Pakhovsk-Mirnograd sector. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, assault units of the Second Army are advancing through the eastern parts of Pakhovsk and the Donetsk district while completing the mop-up of the Riviera area. More importantly, Russian forces have entered the village of Gishino, southwest of Pakhovsk. That village has served as the forward base from which Ukrainian forces attempted repeated counterattacks to break the encirclement of their garrison in Pakhovsk, a garrison now largely compressed into the neighboring town of Mirnograd. Once Gishino falls, that entire Ukrainian defensive system in this sector collapses. There is mounting evidence that the Ukrainian command has already accepted that it cannot save the encircled grouping in Mirnograd. Reports and videos suggest that Kiev has quietly begun withdrawing units from the Pokrovsk area over the last few days, while Russian troops have retaken northern Rodinska and are again pressing toward Belitska, a town to the north they had threatened earlier in August and early autumn before pulling back under Ukrainian counterattacks. With Rodinska seemingly secure and Gashino under assault, the Ukrainian position in the entire sector is crumbling. Once Gashino is fully secured and the last fortified strongpoint in Mirnograd is ground down, the Battle of Pokrovsk-Mirnograd will end as a decisive Russian success. The picture in Zaporozhye is similar. Both Ukrainian and Russian sources now admit that Russian troops have entered the town of Guliapol. Kyiv concedes that an entire brigade tasked with defending the town collapsed, with many men fleeing, which allowed Russian forces to roll up Ukrainian positions to the west of Guliapol, take the eastern districts, and fight their way toward the center. The Ukrainians claim they have stabilized the situation with redeployed, more seasoned units. The Russians acknowledge the arrival of reinforcements, but insist that their advance, though slowed, continues. As always, we will know the exact line of control only later, but at this stage in the war there is one constant. Any stabilization achieved by Kyiv is temporary at best. The direction of travel is one way, and it favors Russia. The price of trying to hold Guliapol may also be severe for Ukraine elsewhere. Russian reports state that to shore up that sector, Kyiv has stripped troops from other key nodes in the Zaporozhye defensive line, notably from the town of Orakov and from the fortified village of Pokrovska to the north. In other words, Ukraine may win a brief respite in Guliapol at the cost of weakening its entire regional defense. If Russian forces exploit those gaps, they can accelerate advances elsewhere, potentially surrounding Guliapol itself. In that case, instead of a second-rate brigade being driven out, some of Ukraine's best remaining units could find themselves trapped in yet another cauldron. This is the pattern the Ukrainian command now faces everywhere. A choice not between good and bad options, but between bad and worse. Further north, there are persistent reports of renewed Russian pressure around Seversk and Lyman, and of advances near Borova on the eastern bank of the Oskol River. Borova represents one of the last patches of territory east of the Oskol still under Ukrainian control. Its significance is that if Russia takes Borova and Lyman while consolidating gains after the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd battle and the expected fall of Konstantinovka, the road opens to a renewed Russian thrust on Izium west of the Oskol. Should Izium fall back into Russian hands, the large Ukrainian groupings in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the core of their Donbass deployment, would face the very real prospect of encirclement in a massive operational cauldron larger than anything seen in the war so far. At the same time, Russian forces are reported to be consolidating in Kharkov region, pushing south from Volchansk and mopping up Ukrainian units caught east of Kupiansk. Conditions there have been so dire that it would not be surprising if, in addition to combat losses, some Ukrainian troops have succumbed to exposure. In the broader Kharkov axis, there is talk of further Russian operations in preparation, adding to Kyiv's mounting list of crises. Another ominous sign comes from Kherson. Ukrainian authorities have reportedly ordered all government agencies to evacuate the city on the western bank of the Dnieper, and British media have described Kherson as a ghost city from which the civilian population has largely fled. That framing looks like psychological preparation of Western audiences for a serious battle in and around Kherson, and for the possibility that the largest city Ukraine retook from Russia in 2022. The crown jewel of its much vaunted counteroffensive may be lost again. Rumors continue to circulate about Russian landings and raiding parties on the western bank of the river, even within or near Kherson itself. There is little verifiable video, and weather conditions at this time of year make large-scale amphibious operations extremely difficult. But the fact that Kyiv is emptying its own administrative presence on that bank suggests that it expects trouble and perhaps anticipates that Russia is probing for weaknesses it can exploit once the ice and weather patterns shift. We now also have a much clearer picture of a recent failed Ukrainian special operation in the Pakhovsk area, an operation personally overseen by Budanov and involving special forces inserted by helicopter. Earlier speculation suggested that Kyiv might have been trying to extract a trapped VIP from the encircled Pakhovsk pocket. Authoritative information now points to a different purpose. The Russians had deployed an elite sniper and drone unit there, which was extremely effective in interdicting Ukrainian movement, preventing reinforcements from reaching the garrison and blocking attempts by the encircled troops to break out. With the cauldron newly closed in early November, that unit became a critical obstacle. Budanov's plan, it seems, was to drop special forces into the area to eliminate that Russian sniper drone team. Instead, Russian reconnaissance and loitering munitions detected and annihilated the Ukrainian insertions in the open. The result was not a daring rescue, but a disastrous ambush, reminiscent in its way of the legendary sniper duel stories from Stalingrad, except that this time it was Ukrainian special forces who paid the price. If the military situation on land is grim for Kyiv, developments at sea are becoming even more dangerous. 2 oil tankers steaming toward the Russian port of Novorossiysk in the Black Sea were recently hit and severely damaged. Initial Turkish reporting suggested that they struck mines, but Russian sources quickly pointed to drone attacks, and Kiev has now admitted that these were deliberate strikes carried out by Ukrainian unmanned surface vessels, sea drones. Western media has tried to soft-pedal the story by labeling the ships Russian tankers. In fact, neither vessel was Russian-owned nor sailed under the Russian flag. One reportedly flew the flag of an African country. These were third-country ships engaged in legitimate commercial traffic, attacked in international waters by Ukraine, a state that is not formally at war with their owners. There is widespread speculation that Kiev did not act alone, that Western intelligence and maybe Western naval assets assisted or facilitated the attack. Given the long track record of British involvement with Ukrainian maritime operations, it would not be surprising if London's fingerprints were present. But I will not speculate beyond what is known. What matters is that this was an extraordinarily reckless and desperate step. Novorossiysk is not just an outlet for Russian oil. It is also the terminal for Kazakh and other Central Asian exports. No one can state with certainty whether the cargoes these tankers were expected to lift were Russian barrels or Kazakh. Either way, Kazakhstan is furious and has lodged strong protests with Kyiv over both the drone attacks on Novorossiysk and the broader risks to its export routes, even if some of those protests have been more private than public. President Erdogan cannot be pleased either. Turkey has built a profitable and strategically important energy partnership with Russia. The last thing Ankara wants is uncontrolled escalation in the Black Sea that endangers the energy trade. Erdogan also knows that Russia has the means to respond in ways that could fundamentally alter the naval balance and commercial flows. Contrary to Western talk of a Ukrainian naval victory in the Black Sea, Russia retains the capability to impose a de facto blockade on Odessa whenever it chooses, simply by declaring that ships entering those waters are entering a war zone and may be treated as legitimate targets. Moscow has refrained from doing so, not because it lacks the power, but because it has listened to the concerns of the global South, which has been worried, understandably, about spikes in grain prices and the knock-on effects on food security. Now, however, Russia can point out to its partners in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that while it has exercised restraint on Ukrainian grain exports, Kyiv is attacking oil tankers flying global South flags. If Ukraine continues down this path, Moscow will have a more compelling case to argue that any retaliatory action against shipping to Ukrainian ports is a forced response, not a first step. Whether Russia will take that step is an open question, but only a fool would assume that the option is off the table. Western oil interests will also be uneasy. If Kazakh crude is disrupted, Western companies that rely on those flows will feel the pain. For the moment, I expect Russia to respond in its usual measured way, by providing naval escorts and organizing convoys for tankers heading to Novorossiysk, much as it has already done in the Baltic. That is the kind of low-drama, high-discipline answer we have seen repeatedly from Moscow throughout this conflict. But the underlying message is brutal. Kyiv's leadership is becoming so desperate to regain leverage that it is willing to endanger neutral shipping and alienate countries it depends on for diplomatic sympathy. This is not a sign of strength. It is an admission of weakness. All of this plays out against a diplomatic backdrop that is quietly but steadily consolidating in Russia's favor. The narrative that Russia is isolated is a fantasy sustained by Western media echo chambers. In reality, Moscow's relationships are deepening with key players across Eurasia and the global south. Saudi Arabia and Russia have agreed to visa-free travel between their citizens, mirroring earlier arrangements between Russia and China. That move is more than a symbolic gesture. It is a clear indication that Riyadh has no intention of distancing itself from Moscow, whatever Washington might prefer. Trump reportedly pressed Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman during his recent visit to the U.S. to join the Abraham Accords and normalize relations with Israel. MBS refused, insisting that Saudi Arabia cannot take that step without meaningful movement toward a real Palestinian state, a position anchored in Saudi public opinion. The Saudis want to preserve relations with the United States, but they also value their partnership with Russia and will not jeopardize it to satisfy Washington's whims. In the same vein, the Financial Times has reported that a major Chinese drone manufacturer has acquired a significant stake in a Russian drone company. Western analysts hyperventilate about a deepening military-industrial axis between Moscow and Beijing. But the broader point is simple. The myths about India and China cutting their economic ties with Russia after new U.S. sanctions are just that, myths. Putin is flying to New Delhi on 4 December for a major summit with Prime Minister Modi. Trade, energy cooperation, defense, and high-technology collaboration continue to expand. On the same days that Rubio, Witkoff, and Kushner are in Moscow, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi will also be there, likely meeting Putin, Lavrov, and other senior officials. Far from being socially isolated and economically strangled, Russia is deeply embedded in an evolving multipolar network spanning China, India, Saudi Arabia, and much of the non-Western world. Europe, by contrast, has marginalized itself by choice. There is a superb analysis on the Substack Caligula the Contemplator titled Europe's Hysteria and Strategic Unraveling. Russia is symptom, not cause, which captures the pathology well. European leaders have allowed their anti-Russian obsession to corrode any capacity for independent diplomacy. With the exception of figures like Viktor Orban and occasionally Robert Fico, no senior European politician regularly travels to Moscow or engages in serious talks with Russian leaders.